My son thought I'd spent the 3 weeks before my retirement party sitting on the back porch, watching the leaves come down off the oak tree Donna planted in 1998. He figured the old man was finished. That I was tired enough to sign whatever he put in front of me and be grateful someone was handling it. Derek knew I missed her. He knew 31 years at the shop had worn my knees down to bone. He knew I'd been ready to hand things off for a while. He just didn't know who I'd been talking to. He didn't know Amy had called me in October. He didn't know what she said. He didn't know I'd spent those 3 weeks in Tom Briggs's office on Court Street, in a chair that was probably 20 years old, going through every account, every document, every contract attached to my name. He didn't know about the LLC, and he absolutely did not know about the $47,000. That Saturday at the VFW Hall on Route 40, Derek stood up in front of 60 people I'd known since before he could drive. He raised his glass. He smiled at Shannon, who was already looking at the room like it was hers. He announced he had negotiated the sale of Harmon's auto service, $152,000. I was sitting 4 tables over, in the same seat I'd sat in at every union dinner, every retirement party, every fish fry for 30 years. I reached for the mug Donna gave me after the Reds game in 2003. The white one with the cracked handle she never let me throw away. I still bring it places. Old habit. I picked it up. I didn't say a word. I let him finish his whole speech. Then I asked the one question he wasn't ready for. If you've watched Behind Dad before, you know the channel. If you're new, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with me. What happened at that retirement party changed things between me and my son in ways I'm still sorting through 2 years later. And there's a part of me that isn't sure I handled everything exactly right. But I'll tell you what I did, and you can decide. My name is Roy Harmon. I am 61 years old. I was born in Huber Heights, Ohio, graduated from Wayne High School in 1981, and started working at a garage on Little York Road the week after graduation because the owner, a man named Gene Stivers, told me I had better hands than most of his adult employees. Gene wasn't a complicated person. He paid fair, expected you to show up, and fired 2 men in my first month for taking 45 minutes on a lunch break that was supposed to be 30. I learned more from Gene in 3 years than I learned in 12 years of school. And I mean that as a compliment to Gene and a statement of fact about school. Gene had a rule about honest work that I have never seen improved upon in 40 years. You tell the customer what's wrong. You tell them what it costs. You do what you said you'd do. You charge what you said you'd charge. That's the whole job. He posted that on a laminated card above the register in the shop. When he retired and I was 23, he took the card off the wall and handed it to me. I still have it, framed, in the office on Route 40. By 1991, I had enough saved, barely to lease a base space on Route 40 outside of Huber Heights. I signed a 3-year lease and called the place Harmon's Auto Service. I was 27 years old, and I had $1,200 in my checking account after I wrote the deposit check. My father lent me $800 more to cover first month's supplies, and I paid him back in 4 months. He never mentioned it again. That was how he was. I want to be specific about what I built, because it matters to everything that comes after. Harmon's Auto grew from 1 bay to 3 by 1996. By 2001, I owned the building. I bought it when my landlord retired and offered me a right of first refusal, and I got a conventional bank loan at a rate I thought was too high but accepted because the alternative was renting forever. By 2006, I had 4 full-time mechanics, 2 of whom are still with me. One of them, Tony Presta, started with me in 2003 when he was 22 years old, and I was the 3rd shop he'd interviewed at that week. He told me later the reason he took the job over 2 higher-paying offers was that I showed him the shop floor before I offered him anything. He said most places showed him the break room. I thought the floor was what mattered. I built a fleet service contract with a regional trucking company out of Dayton Prestige Transport that gave me guaranteed volume every quarter for 11 years. I built a second contract with a municipality for vehicle maintenance on county equipment. I ran the shop 6 days a week, 4:30 in the morning to 6 in the evening for the first 12 years, and then 6 to 4 after my knees started telling me things I didn't want to hear. I missed one Christmas with the family in 31 years, 2009, when we had a pipe burst in the shop, and I spent Christmas Eve managing the emergency and Christmas morning on the phone with an insurance adjuster. Donna brought a plate of food to the shop that afternoon and sat with me in the office while I ate it. In 2022, when I finally had an independent appraisal done, Harmon's auto service was valued at $380,000. That's equipment, leasehold improvements, the fleet contracts, the established customer base, and the business reputation. 4.7 stars on Google, with 414 reviews. I never asked for a single review. The customers left them because they came back, and they came back because we never sold them something they didn't need. Gene Stiver's laminated card. 31 years of it. Donna was beside me for all of it. She was an X-ray technician at Kettering Health for 22 years. She was the person in our house who read every contract before I signed it. She could look at a paragraph and tell you which sentence was going to cause a problem in 18 months. She was right more often than any lawyer I ever hired. She did our business taxes herself until 2009, when I finally had enough going on that we needed someone else to do it. She was not a woman who made noise about what she contributed. She just contributed. When the kids were small and money was tighter than I let on, she picked up extra shifts at Kettering without telling me why, and I didn't find out until later that she'd been padding the emergency fund. She said she didn't want me to feel like I hadn't built enough. That was her protecting me from a worry that was hers by rights to name. We met at a barbecue at a mutual friend's house in 1984. She was 21. I was 20. She was arguing with someone about the best route from Dayton to Cincinnati, which she turned out to be right about. And I walked over because I wanted to hear someone who was that certain about directions. We got married in 1986. We raised 2 children in the same house on Greenmont Avenue I still live in. She planted the oak tree in the backyard in 1998 because the previous owners had put in a concrete slab that she said looked like a parking lot pretending to be a yard. Donna died in November of 2020. Breast cancer, diagnosed in March, gone in November. 8 months. When something happens that fast, you don't process it in real time. You process it later, in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, when you reach for 2 coffee mugs out of habit and then put one back. I kept her mug. The white one from the Reds game in 2003. We'd gone to the game for her birthday, sat in the upper deck, eaten overpriced hot dogs, and she'd bought the mug at the souvenir stand on the way out because she said she needed something to prove she'd been there. She dropped it once doing the dishes and cracked the handle but wouldn't throw it away because she said things that still worked, didn't need to be replaced, just because they weren't perfect anymore. I've thought about that sentence a lot in the 4 years since she died. I think she was talking about more than the mug. Derek is 34 years old. He is my son. He is also, if I'm being honest with myself in a way it took me too long to get to, a man who learned early that things would eventually work out for him, usually because someone he loved was working hard to make sure they did. He was not a bad kid. I want to be clear about that. He was not cruel as a child, not selfish in any mean way, not the kind of teenager who made his mother cry or his father lose sleep. He was likable in the way that charming, unfocused people often are. Everyone's glad to see him walk in. Nobody worries too much when he doesn't follow through on what he said. He played baseball in high school, worked summers at the shop sweeping floors and changing oil, and had enough social ease to move through rooms without friction. That ease was real. It was not manufactured. What was also real? Derek had never had to build anything from scratch. Everything he'd tried had been launched with support, and when it ended, the support absorbed the cost without making him name it. The landscaping business that lasted 1 season, I fronted him $2,000 in equipment rental that we never talked about again. The power washing business, a truck with specialized equipment that I co-signed a note on, sold at a loss when the business closed. A difference covered quietly by a loan from my personal savings, that Derek called a gift when he brought it up once, and then never mentioned again. I let him do that. That is something I sit with. In 2019, Derek told me he wanted to open a second auto service location in Trotwood. He had done research, he said. He had a location he'd found. He'd done a market analysis. He showed me a document that he had clearly put work into, laid out neatly, with columns and projections. What he needed was help with suppliers, a co-signer on the lease, and the credibility that came with the Harmon name behind him while he was getting started. I co-signed the lease. I co-signed an equipment credit line. I introduced him to Meridian Parts, my supplier of 17 years, owned by a man named Earl Whitfield who had trusted me with credit terms that were the equivalent of a handshake extended over nearly 2 decades of fair dealing. I told Earl that Derek was my son and that I vouched for him. I want you to understand what I was handing him when I said that to Earl. The Meridian relationship had been built on 17 years of invoices paid on time, discrepancies flagged and corrected quickly, and every commitment honored without needing reminders. Earl had offered me extended payment terms twice during difficult quarters, once in 2008, when the recession hit and fleet clients started delaying renewals, and once in 2014, when I had a large equipment failure, cost me $30,000 in a single month. Both times I used the extension and paid it back within 60 days. That was what my word with Earl was worth, and I gave that to Derek as a starting point. Like someone handing their kid a car they built piece by piece over 2 decades. I should not have done that without knowing more. But Donna had been gone less than a year. Derek was my son. The shop was the thing we had in common. And I thought I genuinely believed that helping him build something was the same as building something together. Shannon, Derek's wife, 4 years into the marriage by then, had been in the picture since 2017. I want to be careful about how I describe Shannon, because I don't think she's a simple villain. I think she is a practical woman who grew up in a household where social positioning mattered enormously, who had married a man with more charm than ambition, and who looked at what Roy Harmon had built over 31 years and made a quiet calculation about what that might eventually be worth and who might eventually benefit from it. She didn't announce any of this. She didn't need to. It came through in accumulation in the way she described Derek's plans at family dinners, in the way she referred to the shops, plural, possessive, when the Trotwood location was barely 6 months old, in the way she never asked me direct questions about Harmon's operations, but was always in earshot when I answered questions Derek asked. There was a Sunday afternoon in early 2021, maybe a year into the Trotwood shop, when Shannon and I were in the kitchen after lunch while Derek was outside with the kids. She was washing a dish. "Didn't look up," she said, in a tone that was somehow both casual and not. "Roy, have you thought about what comes next with the Route 40 shop? Derek worries about you carrying it alone." She said this as if Derek had expressed worry, which may or may not have been true. She said it as if the next step was naturally Derek inheriting something that was already more his than mine in some structure that hadn't been named yet. I said, "I'll know when the time comes." She nodded and kept washing the dish. It was the kind of answer that doesn't invite follow-up. She didn't follow up, but the question had been placed, like something set on a counter to see if anyone noticed where it came from. I noticed. I just didn't do anything about it fast enough. My daughter Amy, who is 30 years old and works as a registered nurse at Ohio State Wexner Medical Center in Columbus, had been calling me more often since 2021. Amy is not an alarmist. She is precise the way her mother was precise. She waits until she has 3 pieces of information before she draws a conclusion from one. When Amy calls more often, it means she's tracking something and hasn't named it yet. We talked about other things first. The Bengals, her work schedule, a trip she was planning with friends. Then one Sunday, in March of 2022, she said, "Dad, I need to tell you something about Derek and Shannon. I need you to listen before you say anything." I said, "Go ahead," she said. "I think they've been using your name with suppliers." I think it's more than the original credit line you co-signed, and I think you need to look at your accounts. I said, Amy, they're running a business. They have access to. She said, Dad, please. Something in the patience of that one word, the particular patience of someone who's been worried for longer than you knew and is choosing this moment carefully. I stopped talking and I listened. 2 days after Amy's call, I was at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in late March, cup of coffee, still cold outside, the screen door off the back porch, making that small rattle in the wind that I keep meaning to fix when my phone rang. It was Earl Whitfield at Meridian Parts. Earl is 66 years old and has run Meridian for 23 years. He is a Methodist, a Cincinnati Reds fan, and a man who I have never heard raise his voice in 2 decades of doing business. He communicates problems with a measured disappointment that is somehow more effective than anger. He also has a habit of opening difficult phone calls with a normal question, which I learned to read years ago. He said, Roy, how are you doing? Not a question. The way he says it, I said, Fine, Earl. What's going on? He said, I need to talk to you about the account. The Trotwood account, attached to your name. It's 6 months past due. The balance is $47,000. Roy, I've been patient with it because it's your name on there. But I need to understand what's happening before my bookkeeper takes it any further. I did not say anything for long enough that Earl said, Roy, you still there? I said, I'm here, Earl. I appreciate you calling me directly. Give me today. I hung up. I sat at that kitchen table for a while without moving. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something. The screen door made its rattle. A car went by on Greenmont Avenue. $47,000. 6 months past due. In my name, I had not ordered a single part from Meridian in 8 months. I had not placed a single transaction on that account. I had co-signed the original credit line for Derek 3 years earlier, and I had assumed without checking, which is not who I am in any other area of my life, that Derek was managing it. I picked up Donna's mug. I held it with both hands, the cracked handle warm against my palm. She used to hold it that way when she was working through something she didn't want to rush. Then I drove to Trotwood. I did not call first. The Trotwood shop was open but quiet for a weekday morning. A car was up on one of the lifts. Shannon's Equinox was not in the lot, which I noted. Derek's truck was. I went in through the service bay and found Derek in the back office, phone to his ear. He hung up when he saw me walk in. His face ran through something surprise, calculation. An attempted landing on relaxed in about half a second. He didn't make it all the way to relaxed. I said, Earl Whitfield called me this morning. He said, Dad. I said, Don't. He stopped. I said, How much do you owe him? He told me a different number. Lower. I said the real number. He looked at the desk. I asked him where the money had gone. He started to explain parts costs that came in over projection, a compressor that had to be replaced unexpectedly, a major account that delayed payment. The explanation had the quality of something constructed in real time, not something he'd been holding ready, not quite a lie, more like a rough sketch of a story that needed more work. I said, Is there anything else on my accounts that you know about? He said, No. I said, Derek, last chance to tell me before I find out another way. He said, No, Dad. That's it. I swear. I said, All right. I drove home. I called Tom Briggs from the truck on the way. Tom is 63, an estate and business attorney who went to Westmont Presbyterian with me and Donna for 15 years and drives a 12-year-old Buick. He refers to as the Buick, in the tone of a man who considers their car a relationship. He has the kind of mind that takes information in faster than he appears to be absorbing it, and then produces organized conclusions that suggest he understood where you were going before you got there. I told him what Earl had told me. I told him what Derek had said. Tom said, "Can you come in Thursday morning?" I said yes. On Wednesday evening, I drove back to Trotwood after hours. Derek had given me a key to the shop 2 years ago for emergencies. I unlocked the side door, turned on the office light, and went to the filing cabinet. I knew Derek's organizational system because I'd helped him set it up. Third drawer, back section. I found the documents in a folder labeled Financing 2022, an equipment financing agreement, a credit account extension with Dalton Capital, a regional small business lender. The cosigner line on both read, Roy L. Harmon. I have signed my name on contracts, checks, forms, and documents approximately 10,000 times in 30 years of business. I know what my signature looks like. The way I know what a wheel bearing sounds like when it's failing immediately, without having to think about it. What was on those documents was close, careful, even. But it was not mine. I photographed every page on my phone. I put the folders back exactly where I'd found them. I turned off the light. I locked the door. I drove home in the dark. I sat at the kitchen table with Donna's mug and a cup of coffee that went cold while I sat there. I didn't drink it. I held it. I thought about how long. I thought about what else. I thought, this is not the whole picture. This is just what I found in 40 minutes. When I got to Tom's office Thursday morning, Amy was already there. I had not asked her to come. Tom had called her because Amy had reached out to Tom directly 2 weeks before she called me. She had found Tom's contact through Donna's paperwork. Donna had worked with Tom on their will back in 2018. Amy had gone to Tom because she didn't want to scare me before she knew what she was actually looking at. She had been worried about her father, and she had handled it the way her mother would have, quietly and with documentation. Amy had gathered 3 months of bank records from an account Derek and I had nominally co-held for business transition purposes, an account I had largely stopped monitoring because Derek had taken over management of it. She had tracked 6 transactions that went from that account to Shannon's personal LLC, a real estate and property management company Shannon had registered in her maiden name in 2021. Not enormous amounts in isolation. 11,000 here, 8,000 there. But the pattern across 3 months added up to $31,000 that had left the business transition account and ended up somewhere that was not Harmon's Auto and was not Meridian Parts and was not any vendor I recognized. Amy said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have told you sooner. I was afraid you'd be angry with me for looking." I said, "Why would I be angry with you?" She said, "Because it's Derek." I said, "That doesn't change what the numbers are." Tom had the loan documents I'd photographed analyzed by a forensic document specialist he used for estate dispute work. The specialist's opinion, delivered by email 2 days later. The signatures on both documents showed characteristics inconsistent with the original signature samples Tom provided. Not conclusive, he noted, but materially inconsistent. Tom looked at me over his desk, which was stacked with papers in a way that seemed chaotic, but he navigated without ever losing anything, and said, "Roy, we need to talk about what you want to do." I said, "Tell me the options." He told me. We could report the forgery to the DA's office. We could file a civil claim. We could confront Derek directly and give him the opportunity to make it right before involving the law. Or we could do something different. Something that didn't require me to destroy my son in a public legal proceeding before I understood the full picture. I sat with that for a minute. Then I asked, "What do I need to do to protect the shop itself?" Tom leaned back. He said, "We transfer the business assets to a properly structured LLC that you control and that Derek is not party to. Before any sale can happen, before any authority claim can be made, we move everything to clean ground. Then we deal with the accounts." I said, "How long does that take?" He said, "If we move today, 3 weeks." I said, Then let's move today. The retirement party was 6 weeks away. Derek had organized it. He'd booked the VFW hall on Route 40, ordered food from a catering company Shannon had recommended, invited everyone, my employees, my suppliers, my customers, people from church, people from the neighborhood. He had promoted it as a celebration. He meant it to be. I believe he genuinely meant it to be. What he also meant it to be, I learned from Amy 2 weeks later, was a public announcement of the sale he had been negotiating without my knowledge. A regional auto service chain called ProDrive was expanding into the Dayton market. They were buying independent shops. Derek had contacted them 4 months earlier, representing himself as the operational manager and majority interest successor of Harmon's Auto. He had given them a business summary that undervalued the shop by approximately 60%. The offer they had come back with was $152,000. Derek had accepted, in principle. He was planning to present it to me at the party as a fait accompli, a done deal I would be grateful for, because what was I going to do with a shop at 61 with bad knees anyway? When Amy told me this, I was on the back porch. I did not go inside right away. I sat in the cold for about 10 minutes. Then I went in and started making calls. What I did in those 3 weeks is not dramatic in the way that movies present legal maneuvering. It was paperwork and phone calls and early mornings at Tom's office on Court Street, going through documents with the same attention I'd give a diagnostic. What's the system supposed to do? What's it actually doing? Where's the fault? Tom Briggs had been a business and estate attorney in Dayton for 30 years. He is the kind of man who is easy to underestimate the first time you meet him, because he drives a 12-year-old Buick and keeps his office in a condition that looks like a filing system only he understands. The second time you meet him, you understand that he understood your situation before you finished explaining it, and that the disorganized appearance of his desk is simply the result of processing a very high volume of information with a method that isn't yours to question. The third time, you realize you should have called him sooner. Tom transferred the Harmon's auto assets, equipment, contracts, intellectual property, the business name and reputation, the customer list, the Google business account, everything attached to the operational value of the shop into a new entity called Harmon Automotive Properties, LLC. My name only. Tom as registered agent. I signed the documents on a Thursday afternoon with Tom's paralegal as witness, and Tom himself standing at the window of his office drinking coffee from a paper cup. And when I put down the pen, he said, without turning around, "That's done. Nobody touches it now without going through me." I said, "Good." He said, "Now, the Meridian account." I had already decided what I was going to do about Meridian. I was going to pay it myself, not because I was accepting responsibility for Derek's debt, but because Earl Whitfield had trusted me, and the $47,000 was attached to my name, and I was not going to let Earl carry that while legal proceedings ran their course. I wrote a personal check from my savings account. It left me with less than I'd had before, but not without a floor. I'd built the floor over 31 years. I called Earl and told him the balance would be cleared by end of week. He said, "Roy, you don't have to," and I said, "I know, but I want to." He said, "I appreciate it." He didn't ask me to explain the situation. That was Earl. That was what a 17-year relationship built on fair dealing actually looks like when it matters. Tom and I also sent formal notice to every supplier and credit relationship attached to my name that any future credit authorizations, account extensions, or business agreements using Royale, Harmon as a reference or guarantor, required direct phone or written confirmation from me personally, not from anyone claiming to act on my behalf. From me. Derek received a copy of that notice. He called me the next morning. He said, "Dad, what is this?" I said, "Standard protective measure, Derek. I should have done it earlier." He said, "Are you saying you don't trust me?" I sat with that for a second. Outside my kitchen window, the oak tree was past its peak for the year. Most of the orange and gold was gone. Just brown now. And the last one's coming down. I said, I'm saying I should have paid more attention to my accounts. Now I am. He started to say something else. I said, Derek, I'll see you at the party Saturday. And I ended the call. He didn't call back that day. He called twice the next day. I let them go to voicemail. I didn't listen to the voicemails until the night before the party. In the first one, he was conciliatory. In the second one, he sounded like Shannon had coached him calmer, more formal, specific phrases about transition planning and aligned vision that sounded like someone else's script. I deleted both of them and went to bed. The morning before the party, I sat on the back porch with coffee. It was early November, and cold, the kind of Ohio November cold that convinces you it's already December. The oak tree in the backyard had about a dozen leaves left on it. Donna used to say the last leaves were the ones that fought the hardest, and she said it like it was a compliment. I used to say the last leaves were just the ones that hadn't gotten the message yet. And she'd tell me I was not as funny as I thought I was. I held the coffee mug with both hands. I thought about Donna reading this whole situation the way she would have read it slowly, completely, without letting how she felt about the people involved change what the document said. She would have known about Shannon 6 months before I did, maybe a year. She would have had a specific conversation with Derek about it, in this kitchen, at this table, that would have been so clear and so undeniable that Derek would have had to make a different choice. Or he'd have made the same choice, and she would have been ready 3 years earlier than I was. She wasn't here, so I was doing it my way. My way had taken longer. It had cost me more from my savings. But the thing I'd built was protected, and I was walking into that party with a clean answer to every question I might need to answer. I rinsed the mug, dried it, and put it in my jacket pocket to bring with me. A note about Amy. I want to say something about my daughter before we get to the party, because she doesn't get enough of this story. Amy is 30 years old. She works 12-hour shifts in a cardiac unit at Ohio State Wexner. She drives 2 hours each way to see me once a month and texts me every Sunday morning to ask how the shop is. She is the kind of person who sends a card for every birthday and shows up when she says she will and has never once asked me for anything she didn't need. She was the one who found out first. She was the one who went to Tom before she came to me because she wanted to protect me from something I might not be ready to hear. She could have told me earlier. She could have told me louder. She didn't. Because she was trying to figure out exactly how bad it was before she handed me information I couldn't unknow. I am not always easy. I am not always good at hearing things I don't want to hear. Amy knew that, and she handled the timing the way Donna would have. With patience, she shouldn't have had to manufacture. She deserves more credit in this story than I've given her in the telling. I wanted to name that directly. The VFW hall on Route 40 looks exactly the way VFW halls in Ohio are supposed to look. Drop ceiling, folding tables, a small bar in the back, flags on the wall, and a parking lot that never has quite enough spaces. I have been to probably 40 events in that room over 30 years. The smell of it, industrial cleaner, old carpet, whatever someone's cooking in the kitchen is as familiar to me as my own garage. Derek had set it up nicely. Tables covered, centerpieces, a projector screen at the front. I noticed the projector right away when I walked in, which told me the presentation was still planned. He hadn't changed course. 60 people approximately. My mechanics. All 4 of them. Tony Presta, who'd worked for me for 19 years and once refused a $20 an hour offer from a competitor shop because he said he didn't trust the water filtration system there. Earl Whitfield and his wife, which I had not expected, and which meant Earl had genuinely come to support me, not to collect anything. 3 guys from church, 2 from the Lions Club, half a dozen longtime customers who had become something more than customers. My neighbors, the Pedersons, who had watched my house for 3 weeks when Donna and I went to Myrtle Beach in 2015 and didn't ask for anything back. Shannon was there in a dress that suggested she'd imagined a different kind of evening than the one coming. She was greeting people at the door like a host. Derek was at the front, talking to a man I didn't recognize but who I figured quickly was from ProDrive, given the way Derek kept angling the conversation toward the projection screen. I found my seat at table 4 and sat down. Someone had put a coffee set up at each table. I poured from the carafe and then reached into my jacket pocket and put Donna's mug on the table in front of me. I'd brought it from home. Old habit at these things. Shannon caught my eye from across the room. She smiled. I nodded. That was all. I looked at Derek. He caught my eye too. He raised his chin, the universal gesture of acknowledgement, and I nodded back. He didn't read anything in my face. People usually didn't. That was something Gene Stivers had taught me early. The most useful thing you can develop in a shop is the ability to look perfectly calm while you're figuring out exactly what's wrong and how bad it is. Tony Presta slid into the seat beside me. He had a plate of something from the catering table and looked at it without enthusiasm. He said, "Good turnout, Roy." I said, "Good group of people." He said, "Shannon's been over there talking to that guy in the blue jacket for about 20 minutes. I said, "I know." Tony looked at me. He'd worked beside me long enough to know when a sentence was a complete sentence and when it was the beginning of something bigger. He turned back to his plate and didn't say anything else. Dinner was decent. The catering was fine. People told old stories, most of which were funnier in the telling than they had been in the living. Gene Stivers had passed away in 2018, but 2 of his old employees were in the room, and one of them told the story about Gene firing a guy for taking long lunch breaks, and I laughed at it the same way I'd laughed when I first heard it 40 years ago. Derek was good at working a room. I want to be honest about this because it's part of who he is. He moved table to table, shook hands, laughed at the right moments, thanked people for coming, said the right things about his mother in a way that made several people tear up. He was, in the genuine moments, good at being Derek. That was the part that had always made things complicated. Shannon stayed near the projector screen most of the evening. Around 8 o'clock, Derek moved to the front of the room. He tapped a microphone. The room settled. He talked about me. He talked about the shop, the years, the work. He talked about Donna. He said things that were true and said them with feeling, and I believe that feeling was real. There was a version of this speech, in a different version of this evening, that I would have been grateful for and moved by. Then his voice shifted slightly, still confident, but with something underneath it, and he said, "And I know Dad's been thinking about what comes next. About what happens to the thing he spent 31 years building. So tonight, with everyone here who's been part of this story, I want to share some news." The ProDrive representative, a man named Carl Denton, as I later found out, straightened in his seat. Derek said, "I've been working with a regional partner to ensure that Harmon's auto service continues and grows. The transition plan we've finalized is something I'm proud of, and I know it represents exactly the future Dad deserves after everything he's built." He looked at me. He said, $152,000. That's the sale price we've negotiated with ProDrive for Harmon's auto. Dad, that's your retirement. The room was quiet for about 3 seconds. Some people began to clap. Slowly, uncertainly, because the mood in the room was reading something that the words hadn't quite said yet. I picked up Donna's mug. I held it by the cracked handle. I looked at the bottom of it, where there was a coffee ring I'd never quite gotten out from when I forgot to wash it after the Reds game the week she bought it. I didn't move. Tony Presta had gone completely still beside me. The clapping stopped when people realized I wasn't reacting. 60 people in a VFW hall, and the room went the kind of quiet that only happens when everyone understands simultaneously that something is not right. Derek kept his smile, but his eyes were doing something different from his mouth. I set the mug down carefully. I stood up. I buttoned the middle button on my jacket the way I always do when I'm about to say something I've thought about for a while. I said, "Derek." My voice came out at the same volume I use to talk to a customer when I'm explaining what's wrong with their car. Not loud, clear. I said, "I appreciate what you put together tonight. I really do. These are good people. And I'm glad they're here. I looked around the room once. 60 faces watching me. I said, I need to ask you something. In front of these people who've known me since before you were born. Some of them since before you were born. Derek's smile was still there. It had calcified slightly. I said, what happened to the $47,000? The silence after that question was the kind of silence that rooms produce when something that was traveling in one direction suddenly stops. Shannon, from her spot near the projection screen, put her hand on the edge of the table. That was the only thing she did. Just put her hand on the edge of the table. Later, Tony Presta would tell me that was the moment he knew. Derek's smile, the real one, the one he'd been working with all night, finally gave out. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make for good footage. It just left his face. The way the light leaves a room when the power goes out. You don't see it go. You just notice it's gone. He said, Dad. I said, I paid Earl Whitfield 3 weeks ago. The $47,000. From my savings. Because your account with him, the one with my name on it, was 6 months past due. Earl called me because he trusted me, and I owed him that courtesy. Carl Denton, the ProDrive representative, had gone very still. He was a businessman, and businessmen learn to read a room quickly when they need to protect themselves from what's happening in it. I said, I also want to let everyone know that Harmon's auto service is not for sale. It was not authorized to be offered for sale. The business assets were restructured 2 weeks ago into a separate LLC, and no transaction was authorized by me. If anyone has questions about the validity of anything you've heard tonight regarding a sale, I'd refer you to Tom Briggs, who is here tonight and can answer them. Tom raised one hand from the back of the room. He was sitting with his wife and had the same expression he always had when things were going the way he'd anticipated, patient and unsurprised. I looked at Derek one more time. I said, I'm not asking you these things to embarrass you. I'm asking them because the people in this room deserve to know where things stand. The same people you invited to celebrate what I built. Then I sat back down. I picked up the coffee mug again. I was not calm because I'd mastered some technique of being calm. I was calm because I was past the point of being anything else. I had made my decisions. What happened next was going to happen, and I had said what I needed to say, and the rest was other people's choices. Derek didn't answer the question about the $47,000. Not that night. Carl Denton left quietly about 12 minutes later. He shook my hand on the way out and said he'd be in touch through proper channels. He did not seem angry. He seemed like a man recalibrating. After I sat down, the room did something that rooms do when the script goes wrong. People started doing ordinary things. Refilling coffee, going to the dessert table, talking quietly to the person next to them. It had the feel of a crowd deciding, one by one, what to do with information they hadn't expected to receive. Tony Presta stayed in the seat beside me. He didn't say anything for a long time. He got himself another cup of coffee from the carafe and pushed one toward me, even though I still had mine. Then he said, Roy, just that. And I said, I know, Tony. And he nodded. And that was the whole conversation. Earl Whitfield found me near the end of the evening, as people were starting to say their goodbyes. He is not a demonstrative man. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment and said, Roy, I'm glad I called you directly. I said, I'm glad you did too, Earl. His wife said, We've always said you were a straight shooter. I thanked her. Then they got their coats and left. Derek stood near the back of the room for the last 20 minutes of the party, receiving the uncomfortable attention of people who didn't know what to say to him. He didn't leave early. I give him that. He stayed. In the way that you stay somewhere when leaving would look like running, and he managed himself, as well as a person can manage themselves in that situation. When I finally left, I shook hands with the people near the door. I thanked the VFW staff. I walked to my truck in the parking lot. It was cold and dry, November Ohio cold, the kind that comes with clear skies and no wind, so there's nothing to blame it on. Just cold. I sat in the truck for a minute. I didn't start it right away. I looked at the VFW hall through the windshield, at the light over the entrance, at the handful of people still coming out in small groups. Then, I started the truck and drove home. What happens after a night like that is not what you imagine when you're planning for it. It's not satisfying in a clean way. It's not over. It's the beginning of a long, grinding set of consequences that everyone involved has to live through, and the living through takes longer than the event. Here is what I can tell you happened. Shannon left the VFW hall about 20 minutes after I sat down. She and Derek drove home separately. Tony Presta told me this because he watched them from the parking lot while he was getting his keys. He said Shannon walked to her car, like she was walking to a destination that required her to be somewhere specific, which is the closest Tony's ever gotten to describing urgency. Derek stood in the parking lot for several minutes before he got in his truck. By the next morning, Shannon had retained an attorney. The attorney sent Tom a letter 3 days later, arguing that Derek had been acting as the operational successor of Harmon's auto, with my full knowledge and implied consent, and that the sale agreement with ProDrive had been entered into in good faith. As part of a transition plan, I had consistently discussed and encouraged. Tom responded with the documentation. The business valuation report. The LLC transfer dated and documented before the party, before Derek's announcement, which meant any claim of authority to sell was made after the assets had already been moved. The Meridian account history, showing the pattern of charges made without my knowledge. The forensic document analysis of the co-signed loan documents, the specialist's conclusion, detailed in 12 careful paragraphs, that the signatures were inconsistent with Roy L. Harmon's established signing characteristics. ProDrive withdrew from the transaction within 2 weeks. Carl Denton sent a brief letter through their corporate counsel. It said they were unable to proceed with the sale given unresolved questions about title and authorization. It did not name anyone specifically. It was a corporate letter doing corporate things, which is how businesses protect themselves when families fall apart in negotiations. The forged signature question was referred to the Montgomery County DA's office. I want to be clear. I did not push for this personally. Tom advised me that once forensic documentation existed pointing to possible fraud, certain professional obligations attached to his role. The DA's office opened an inquiry. As of the time of this story, that process is ongoing. I am not going to predict its outcome or pretend I know how I want it to end. Derek came to my house 3 days after the party. He knocked on the back door, the screen door with the rattle, which I had fixed by then actually. I finally got to it the Monday after the party, first thing in the morning at about 7 o'clock. I was at the kitchen table. I heard the knock and I poured 2 cups of coffee before I opened the door. He came in. He looked around the kitchen the way people look at a room when they're trying to figure out what's changed. Nothing had changed. Same 4 chairs. Same calendar on the wall with the Kettering Health logo that I keep because I never buy new calendars. Same crack in the ceiling tile above the window that I keep meaning to fix. He sat down. He looked at the table for a while. He said, "I didn't think of it as stealing." I said, "What did you think of it as?" He said, "I thought it was going to work out. I thought if the Trotwood shop got to where it needed to be, I could cover everything and hand you a good number, and it would be okay." I said, "And Shannon?" Long pause. Longer than I expected. He said, "She told me you weren't going to get a better offer on your own, that you didn't know the current market, that this was actually good for you, and you'd understand eventually." I said, "Did you believe that?" He looked at the table for a moment before he looked at me. He said, "I wanted to." That answer is the most honest thing my son has said to me in 3 years. Not because it absolves him, it doesn't, and I don't think he thought it would, but because I wanted to is a different admission than I believed it. It means he knew, somewhere, that it wasn't exactly right, and he chose to go forward anyway because the wanting was easier than the knowing. I looked at my son, 34 years old, at a kitchen table he'd sat at his whole life. He looked older than he had a week earlier. The performance layer, the ease, the charm, the quick smile was just gone. What was underneath it was a man who'd made a series of bad decisions, trying to build something without the patience to build it the right way, and who was now sitting in the wreckage of it. I did not tell him he was forgiven. I did not tell him we were fine. Those things would have been untrue. And untrue things said at kitchen tables tend to cost more than the conversation they're trying to close. I said, "You need to figure out what you owe and where it went. Not for me, for yourself, and for the legal process that's running now." He nodded. I said, "The Trotwood shop is yours. I didn't touch it. Whatever you've built there is yours to keep or lose. But Harmon's on Route 40 is mine, until I decide what happens to it. And I'll decide on my timeline." He said, "Dad?" I said, "Derek." He stopped. We sat there for another 10 minutes without much to say. I refilled both cups. He drank his coffee. I drank mine from Donna's mug, the cracked handle, the coffee ring that never quite came out. He looked at the mug once, and I thought he might say something about it, but he didn't. Then he stood up. He put his cup in the sink and rinsed it, which was something Donna had taught him to do, and which he still did without thinking. He put his jacket on. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know." He left. I heard the back door close properly. No rattle, since I'd fixed it. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. Outside, a car went by on Greenmont Avenue. The refrigerator made the sound refrigerators make when they're cycling. Normal sounds. House sounds. I drank the rest of my coffee. I put the mug on the counter. Then, I called Tom to confirm what the next steps were. Shannon filed for divorce 3 weeks later. I had not expected that, and I find I don't know what to do with it. She is not someone I can feel sympathy for without complicating myself, but divorce is its own category of consequence, and I don't wish it on people. It happened. What happens next for Derek, in that part of his life, is his to navigate. I want to tell you something I didn't plan to tell you when I started this. I'm not sure I did everything right. I'm not sure the retirement party was the right place to ask the question. I had a reason for choosing that room, 60 people who had known me for 30 years. A public record of what had been said and by whom. A moment where the truth would have witnesses. Those reasons were real. And I am honestly not sure I could have gotten the clarity I needed any other way, because Derek and Shannon had demonstrated over 3 years a consistent capacity for reinterpreting conversations after the fact. Private confrontations with them tended to come out the other side as stories about misunderstandings. But I am also aware that Derek stood in that VFW hall in front of people he'd known his whole life. He stood in front of men I'd worked with, who'd watched him grow up. Earl Whitfield was in that room, a man Derek had borrowed against without the right to. Tony Presta was in that room, Derek's father's mechanic of 19 years, who had more loyalty to Roy Harmon's name than most blood relatives. Whatever happened to Derek professionally and personally in the months after that night was shaped in part by what 60 people witnessed at that party. I chose that. That wasn't an accident. And I'm not sure it was the right choice. I'm not sure a man in his 30s can absorb that kind of correction in public and build something better from it. I don't know if I would have. I have tried to imagine it, and I genuinely do not know. Donna would have handled it differently. She would have found Derek on a Tuesday, not on the weekend, not at a family event, specifically on a Tuesday morning when Shannon was at work, and she would have put the Meridian account statement on the kitchen table between them and said, "I need you to explain this," and she would have waited. And whatever Derek said, she would have responded to the actual thing he said, rather than the thing she expected him to say. And somewhere in that conversation, she would have found the moment where his excuse ran out and the real thing underneath it had to come forward. She was better at that than me. Not because she was softer. She was actually harder. But she was more patient, and she trusted that the truth had enough weight to land on its own without theater. I am not her. I am a man who spent 31 years in a shop and learned that some problems need to be diagnosed in a controlled environment with the right people present, so you can document what you find and know where you stand. That was what I did. Whether it was also the best thing, I honestly don't know. Here is what I've come to, 2 years later. I can live with what I did. I can live with it because the information that came out in that room needed to come out, and it would not have come out any smaller. The documents were real. The numbers were real. The forged signatures were real. None of that was going to be resolved in a private kitchen conversation. It was going to be resolved in a room with lawyers and documentation regardless, and the retirement party was simply where it started instead of where it ended. But the method putting Derek in that position, in front of those people, I'll carry that. Not as shame, exactly. More as knowledge. An accounting of what it costs to get to the truth this way. Derek had to spend 2 years rebuilding in a town that saw him be exposed at his own father's retirement party. That's a weight I put on him, even if the situation he put himself in was the original problem. I don't think he deserved easy consequences. But I think about the difference between the consequences that serve justice and the consequences that serve my need to be seen as right by people whose respect I value. Those might not be the same thing. Here's what I know for certain, when I put the doubt aside. The reputation of Harmon's Auto Service on Route 40 is not a number on a balance sheet. It is Earl Whitfield calling me when an account goes delinquent instead of sending a collections notice, because in 17 years I never made him regret trusting me. It is Tony Presta turning down a better-paying offer because he said he didn't trust the other shop's water filtration system, which is an eccentric reason for a man to stay, but the real reason underneath it is that he trusted Harmon's, and trust is built one invoice at a time over decades. My son borrowed that trust. He didn't build it. He borrowed it the way someone borrows a tool they don't fully understand. Not always meaning to break it, but risking it without the knowledge to prevent the damage. That's the part I can't let be smoothed over. Not because I want him to suffer for it, but because if the thing I spent 31 years building gets reduced to a negotiating chip in someone else's ambition, then I have to ask myself what any of it was for. And that question, I don't have an answer to that I can live comfortably with. So, I kept the shop. I kept my name. I kept the standard Gene Stivers put on a laminated card in 1978. That standard is still on the wall in the Route 40 office, framed, behind the counter where customers drop their keys. You tell them what's wrong. You tell them what it costs. You do what you said. You charge what you said. That's the whole job. Harmon's Auto Service is still open. I am there 4 days a week, which is retirement by my previous standards. Tony runs the day-to-day. He got a raise 2 months after the party, which he didn't ask for and I didn't announce. I just changed the number on his direct deposit. He noticed on his next paycheck and came into the office and said, "Roy." I said, "Don't." He said, "All right." That was the whole conversation. 2 of the mechanics who've been with me over 10 years have expressed interest in buying in when the time comes. I am in conversations with Tom about a structure for that. It would be an employee buyout, phased over several years, with Harmon Automotive Properties LLC as the vehicle. It would mean the shop stays Harmon's. It would mean the people who built it keep building it. That seems right to me. The Trotwood shop is still open under Derek's name. Shannon filed for divorce in December, 3 weeks after the party. Derek is running the shop with 1 mechanic, and as far as I can tell, without any additional credit in anyone else's name but his own. Whether that shop survives depends on whether Derek has learned something in the past 2 years about the difference between borrowing a foundation and building one. I genuinely do not know the answer yet. Amy comes home every 6 weeks. She sits at the kitchen table with her phone face down, which I've noticed, and appreciated. She doesn't push the conversation about Derek. She doesn't ask me to be further along in forgiving him than I am. She mostly asks about the shop, which is the correct question, and listens to the answer. Derek and I had Thanksgiving at Amy's apartment in Columbus. It was Amy's idea. She asked us both, and we both said yes. Because Amy asked and because refusing would have cost her something neither of us wanted to spend. We sat at Amy's table, a small table, folding chairs borrowed from a neighbor, a meal Amy cooked entirely herself, with the focused determination of someone who learned to cook from Donna and is not going to acknowledge out loud that she's trying to resurrect something. And we talked about the Bengals and the weather. We did not talk about the party. We did not talk about the shop. After dinner, Derek helped Amy with the dishes. I watched from the kitchen doorway. He washed. She dried. They talked about something I couldn't quite hear. At one point, Amy laughed a real laugh, not a polite one, and Derek smiled in a way that looked less performed than anything I'd seen from him in years. I went back to the living room. I sat down and looked at Amy's bookshelf. She has a photo of Donna on the second shelf, a snapshot from a vacation in 1999, Donna in a yellow jacket, squinting against the sun. Amy's had it since college. I have the same photo on my refrigerator at home. I sat there for a while. I got the screen door fixed in January. Took 45 minutes and 2 trips to Lowe's because I bought the wrong hinge the first time. On the first morning after I fixed it, I opened the back door and it didn't rattle. I stood there for a second. Just stood there in the cold, in the doorway, feeling the difference. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee in Donna's mug and took it out on the back porch. The oak tree she planted in 1998 is big now, covers most of the yard in summer. In October, it goes orange and gold in a way she used to photograph every year. Always slightly too early, because she was afraid she'd miss the peak. She missed it, most years. The peak lasts about 4 days, and then it's over. I sat on the porch with the mug. The yard was brown and quiet. The neighbor's dog was somewhere behind the fence, doing what dogs do in winter. I'll tell you this much. The thing I built is still standing, and that mattered to me more than the number ever would have. Before you go, there's a question I've been turning over. I told you I'm not sure the retirement party was the right way to do it. That I might have handled the method differently. But here's what I want to know from you. If you found out someone in your family, someone you'd helped, vouched for, handed the keys to had been using your name, your credit, your reputation, while you were still sitting right there, thinking they were building something honest, how long would you have stayed quiet? How much more information would you have needed? Would you have given them the private conversation first, or would you have needed witnesses? Tell me. I'm listening. And if you know someone who has spent 30 years building something only to have someone close to them try to take it apart, quietly send this to them. They need to know they're not the only one. This story is completely fictional and created for dramatic, educational, and entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, locations, and names are products of the imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, businesses, or actual events is coincidental. We hope this story reminds you that what you build honestly belongs to you, and that quiet is not the same as done.